stopped and the wind died down by the time Hugo, Dana and Cressida hit Churchill Square. Cressida practically squealed in delight when she saw all the shops on Western Road. Gap, New Look, Reese, French Connection, not to mention her beloved H&M. Hugo vaguely suggested that they split up. Dana and Cressida head off to the clothes shops, while he made for Waterstones and the excellent City Books a bit further down Western Road, or that little antiquarian bookshop, Colin Page, just off Ship Street. That idea was swatted like a fly by Dana. "Hardly. Be rather letting you off the hook, wouldn't it?" she said. Hugo had accepted it stoically, and also had the good sense not to venture an opinion as to why Cressida could not just wear some of the clothes that her mother had brought with her for the weekend. Western Road thronged with Saturday shoppers, gaggles of women, couples, with the male half usually trailing a few steps behind, and men on their own walking with purpose and military precision in order to get the errand over and done with, and so to the pub. "Oh, God," Hugo groaned. "The pub. That'd be nice. Hair of the dog, peace and quiet, read of the paper, the crossword, maybe watch a bit of sport." He had rallied slightly since early morning. Might just manage a half of something. Hugo stopped at the top of the steps outside the shopping centre. There was a pub, bit gaudy admittedly, with huge outdoor heaters, but people drinking outside. He wondered if perhaps he might sit there while the women looked inside the shopping centre. Perhaps he could be called when needed to deal with the business end of the shopping expedition. Dana gave him a hard stare, and he was dragged across the road. Bloody dangerous, isn't it? Giant double-decker buses coming in all directions, hundreds of bus stops lining the pavement, what seemed like hundreds, and hordes of people waiting in lines, while the buses thundered past at breakneck speed. No warning, except for a deafening blast of a horn if you didn't hurl yourself out of the way. And into the infamous H&M. Cressida could hardly contain her excitement. The place was enormous. Miles upon miles of rails, shelves, mannequins, or so it seemed to Hugo, floors up and down, and packed to the hilt with teenagers, pushing and shoving and grabbing. Signs everywhere announced a mid-season event, whatever that meant. Discount, I hope, Hugo thought. Hugo examined some price tickets on a rail marked £10 and under. Looks reasonable enough, he decided. Decent selection of garb. He gestured to Dana and Cressida. "Look at this, all sorts of lovely outfits, and such a bargain too," he told them. That was a good choice of word, bargain. People are always attracted to the idea that they are getting something valuable for next to nothing. The two women immediately headed in the opposite direction towards New Season Collection and ignored him. He was left standing holding an acid yellow t-shirt with beads dangling from the bottom, marked up at £4, until a 13-year-old with pink hair and wearing her mother's lipstick grabbed it from his hand and made off towards the cash desk. Goodness, I'll just wait by the door, he decided. The throngs continued to converge on the shop while Hugo stood by the fire extinguisher next to the entrance. The security guard had him in his sights. Probably thinks I'm a paedophile. Hugo made a big thing of looking at his watch, shaking his head and sighing, much as to say, "Ha! Women, never to be rushed." The security guard didn't crack a smile or nod in sympathy. He just continued to keep Hugo under observation. A woman approached the door from outside, struggling with a buggy and M&S shopping bags. Hugo stepped forward to open it for her. That'll show the security guard. He held the door open, smiling benignly. The woman backed in with a buggy and swept past, not so much as a thank you. "Well, how'd you like that?" Then a swarm of other people traipsed in, pushing and shoving, while he continued to hold the door open, taking full advantage. Not one person thanked him. The security guard smirked. Hugo glared at him. He let go of the door in protest and let it slam, straight into the face of an elderly lady being guided into the shop by a girl who looked like her granddaughter. The elderly lady shook her head at him. The granddaughter muttered, "How rude." The security guard resumed his hard stare, and his observation became surveillance. After about 8 hours, in reality about 50 minutes, Hugo left his post at the fire extinguisher in search of a chair. His head was throbbing again, and the sausage he had eaten at breakfast, behind Dana's back, was repeating on him. Not a sign of them. Bloody hell, what are they doing? He was about to lose his cool when it occurred to him that they had gone up to another floor, found everything that Cressida had wanted, and Dana had paid for it all. Ah, well, okay then, he thought. He relaxed a bit and waited. 20 minutes later, he was irritated again. Surely they were finished by now, even if they paid for the stuff they'd picked out. Hugo ventured towards the escalators. He looked up and then down. Which way? He had no idea. A tall woman in hipster jeans made the decision for him when she pushed forward behind him, forcing him onto the up escalator. It laboured uphill to the top floor at a leisurely pace. Hugo got off, looked around, or at least tried to. It was a needle in a haystack, bodies everywhere, rails of clothes everywhere. No sign of Dana or Cressida. Maybe they were in the changing rooms. Brainwave. He made his way towards an assistant. "Excuse me, where are the ladies' changing rooms, please?" he asked a young woman by rail of dresses. "How the fuck do I know? Do I look like I work here?" snapped a skinny woman in black with a pierced nose. Christ! Hugo was stunned. He didn't know what to say in response, so he stumbled away towards the safety of the cash desk. At least he could be certain of correctly identifying a member of staff there. There wasn't a soul behind the cash registers. He peered at them. Every display on the tills announced, "An assistant nearby will be happy to help you." He looked around. There were no assistants nearby. Hugo went down the escalators again, resumed his place by the fire extinguisher. The security guard was holding the door open for the woman with the buggy as she left the shop. She was laughing and joking with him, and thanking him profusely. No sign of Dana or Cressida. It was now an hour since they had first entered the shop. "Sod it, I've had enough of this." Hugo strode up to the security guard. His neck was thicker than Hugo's thigh. If he had been American, he would have been a quarterback. He stared Hugo down. With what might have been a gulp, after all, Hugo had a very dry throat. On account of the dehydration, he asked, "Excuse me, where are the ladies' changing rooms, please?" Hugo stood on the pavement outside the shop, still waiting, and now fuming. At the suggestion of the security guard, he decided to leave the shop and wait outside. "I'm giving it 5 more minutes and then I'm heading to that pub," he decided firmly. "Hugo! Dad!" Dana and Cressida shouted at him in accusatory tones from across the street. He looked over at them between the passing buses and held up his hands. "What the bloody hell?" he mouthed to them. They dashed over when the coast was clear of traffic. "Hugo, what are you doing standing there?" Dana snapped. "What? Are you joking? What do you think I'm doing?" "Dad, we've been looking everywhere for you," Cressida said. "How the hell can that be? I've been standing in that shop, where I might add I was nearly arrested as a peeping Tom, for the better part of an hour. Where the bloody hell have you two been?" Hugo was in no mood to be trifled with. "Cressida tried on a couple of outfits but couldn't find anything suitable, so we came back down to where we left you, but you disappeared," Dana explained. Hugo couldn't even begin to get his head around this, and was about to launch into an admonishment when Cressida reminded him, "Well, it's Mum's birthday, so it's not fair to be standing here arguing." Dana looked lovingly at Cressida and said, "Come on, let's try Zara. They've got more selection." The women headed back across the road to the shopping centre. Hugo wondered if they served alcohol in the food court, as a bus swerved to avoid hitting him. Alex slipped the guy behind the counter a crisp 50. The young guy, boasting impressive ear stretchers, held it up to the light and squinted. "It's all right, mate. It's kosher. Only printed it this morning." Alex laughed as he read the back of the vinyl he'd just bought. Dying Fetus live in concert. The young guy laughed back. "Ha, yeah, right," and slammed it in the cash register and counted out Alex's change. "To be honest, mate, I wouldn't know a dud from a fake," the guy said, and laughed again. It struck Alex that the 2 words he had used amounted to the same meaning, but since he had just passed what he considered to be a dubious note that fell into both categories, Alex took the change and then headed out onto North Street. Although his old man wouldn't part with any money to give him a sub for the weekend, probably on account of not trusting what Alex would spend it on, Alex still had money in his pocket. He had a stash back in the hotel for emergencies that his grandma Bella had given him, and Juan had loaned him the 50 he had just used on the strength of getting it back tonight when they met up at another pub and gig venue that Juan had promised would be malvado, wicked. This roused even Alex's suspicions, as he didn't know many people who tossed you a £50 loan on the strength of only a few hours' acquaintance. Not unless they were the kind of people who made you offers that you could not refuse. Unless, of course, it was in fact manufactured, and so, in essence, worthless. Shopping accomplished, Alex now turned his attention to the serious matter in hand, a tattoo. He had made careful study and had carried out extensive research on the matter. Several places had been recommended via both the internet and his heavy metal gig colleagues. Juan had sealed the deal, though, with his recommendation of Johnny, his mate in the North Lanes. He did killer tattoos and piercings. Juan's own chasing the dragon tattoo had been Johnny's handiwork. He'd cut Alex a good deal as well, just mention Juan's name. As Alex pushed through the shoppers lolling on the pavement and part of the road along Bond Street, he consulted a napkin upon which had been scrawled, "Blood of Satan, tattoos and body piercing." Never ever take a man shopping with you, Dana decided, as they had to wait yet again for Hugo to catch them up walking through the shopping centre, even if he is paying, because regardless of how much you spend, you pay for it yourself in the end anyway, in terms of sulks, moods, huffs, irritability and general dragging of feet, which latter takes an age to get anywhere or do anything. Hugo had even tried to skulk off to the food court for a cup of coffee. Well, Dana wasn't having that. He'd made his bed when he'd left Cressida's suitcase behind, and now he'd have to lie in it. And that meant going from shop to shop with them until Cress had found what she wanted, and Hugo had borne the brunt of the financial consequences. In fact, in Dana's opinion, which was growing ever more hardline and militant with every obstacle that Hugo attempted to put in their way, he was getting off lightly. She could have insisted that he drive back home for the suitcase. She was no fool. She had realised straight away that he was on a mission to thwart his participation in the shopping expedition, and that he had used every possible weapon in his armoury, wandering off and pretending he couldn't find them, hiding so that he couldn't be found, and then even telling them he was thirsty and needed a coffee. Well, he wasn't going to get away with it. In fact, he ought to thank his lucky stars that he was only being required to replace what had been left behind at home in Cressida's suitcase, and not what he had offered originally, to give Cress some money to embark upon an entirely different type of shopping trip. That first offer would have been a treat. This one was a chore, because it was now born out of necessity, and so the enjoyment of gloss that it might otherwise have had was now absent. No, Hugo should be grateful and stop sulking. Dana and Cressida bounded into Zara, and Hugo treaded heavily behind them, lagging. They parked him beside the door next to a rail of large fluffy scarves and wraps, and gave him strict instructions to remain precisely where he was, and that no argument would be brooked on the matter. Dana didn't care whether the fire alarm went off, an armed robbery took place, or even if he suffered a fatal fit. He looked wounded at that suggestion. In no circumstances whatsoever was he to leave that area. They would be back to fetch him as soon as they had found what they wanted. Cressida immediately headed for the young fashion department and was soon engulfed by leather miniskirts, skinny jeans, Afghan gilets, pleated chiffon dresses and parka jackets. Hugo looked aghast as she carried an armful of garments towards the changing room. Dana looked through rail after rail of evening dresses, having decided to treat herself to a new outfit for dinner tonight. Black, 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 navy. No, not the latter colour, she firmly decided. Might look nice on Kate Middleton, or Windsor now, but not on a middle-aged woman trying to look younger. That gave her pause. Jesus, middle-aged. Since when did I start thinking of myself as middle-aged? Dana asked. One thought of one's parents as middle-aged. Certainly not when one's parents were still alive. Or her mother, at least. Jesus. How depressing. The kids had skipped any notion that Dana and Hugo were middle-aged. They'd gone straight to old. And presumably by that token, Grandma Bella was ancient. It was all very depressing. Is Hugo middle-aged? She asked herself. She stood surveying the clothes with this thought in mind. Yes, he is. Hugo has always been middle-aged, even when he was young. It is all simply a state of mind, Dana decided, and numbers. Essentially, it was how you felt about yourself, and how others felt about you. And anyway, middle-aged is the new 60. Years ago, Dana's parents would have been middle-aged at 40. But now people live to 90 or 100. He was still young at 50. Middle age only began at 60. And with that, Dana turned to face a rail of body-hugging short lace dresses. She went to reach for a bright red lace dress. Her hand wavered. She left it hanging there. Instead, she picked up a very short emerald green lace dress with scoop back and off-the-shoulder sleeves. Perfect for tonight, she told herself. She left the red for danger dress where it was, for now. Despite the fact that this shop was smaller than the previous one, and therefore the press of bodies all vying for a finite number of covetable items was even greater, Hugo found Zara to be a most agreeable shopping destination, all things considered. Firstly, there was no burly, aggressive security guard threatening with his eyes to rip off Hugo's head and feed it to his dogs, or so it had seemed to Hugo at the last shop at the time. Less so now, since the guy was just doing his job, and to be fair, Hugo probably did look like a peeping Tom, or whatever passed for a pervert these days. Secondly, and much more importantly, this shop had the most attractive, enchanting young lady shop assistants, made all the more exotic by the fact of their all being Spanish, or Latin of some variety at any rate. And this was an important consideration for a man banished to the front door and charged with the task of remaining there for what could be an hour or more. And as he stood in exile by the fluffy scarf rail, he amused and entertained himself with the observation of these young ladies, all curiously bearing the name of Monica. He knew this because every so often a call would be made on the shop's PA system beseeching Monica to the cash desk, as the queue grew ever longer at the tills. Monica. How enchanting, Hugo thought, as he watched a very shapely young lady in black with hazel eyes fold and refold a table full of jumpers. Jolly nice. And another young assistant of the same name, with shoulder-length chocolate brown hair and olive skin and a short black skirt, he observed, bend down and rematch all the shoes to its partner under the coat rail. And as he cast his glance towards the tills, yet another lithe, long-limbed Monica strode behind the counter with a very big smile. Just lovely, Hugo grinned, and smiled, and grinned some more, as he daydreamed of all the lovely Monicas in the shop. It never occurred to him that it was an improbable coincidence that all the girls were named Monica, that according to Spain's National Institute of Statistics, Maria was the nation's most popular girl's name, and therefore the likelihood of a Spanish shop full of Monicas was about 1,000,000 to 1. Or that the call, Monica to the cash desk, was a generic catch-all demand for an assistant, any assistant, to get her ass over to the till. As Hugo stood there in his rose-tinted, romantically smudged, halo-rimmed reverie, he saw Cressida emerge from the changing room and stand to one side with her mother, as they decided which of the mountain of garments to hand back to the assistant in the changing room and which to keep. Hugo held his breath for a minute or two as several outfits were held up and examined by the two women. Cressida shook her head and held 3 outfits on their hangers out in the direction of the sales assistant. Good, he thought, but at the last moment Cressida changed her mind and snatched them back, holding the entire shop, so it seemed to Hugo, clutched to her chest. Hugo exhaled. Right, whatever, he thought, although whatever was the last benign thought on his mind. Dana, he observed, also held an item in her hand, some teal-coloured curtain or tablecloth, although even to Hugo's limited knowledge of shopping, the latter seemed an unlikely item to have been sourced in here. Dana caught his eye and waved with a smile. Hugo waved back, not quite matching her enthusiasm in the smile department, as he patted the wallet in his back pocket. Cressida, he noticed, eyed him with suspicion and wariness. Probably thinks I'm going to make a fuss about all that stuff. Well, I'm not. I'll show them. I'll take it on the chin like a man. His newfound iron resolve called to mind a scene from a Clint Eastwood film. He was a big fan of Clint Eastwood, when Clint said, "A good man always knows his limitations." Mind you, he still had Dana's present to buy. That dampened his spirit just a little. And then when he thought about exactly what to buy his wife for her birthday, his shoulders slumped. Always so difficult, especially with limited funds. Bet Camilla's husband, Tristram, has no such worries. Just sends his secretary out to Asprey or De Beers for a trinket or two. It's easy when one has money. Still, it's the thought that counts. Money can't buy everything. Better to buy a single red rose if you've gone out and picked it yourself, rather than a diamond you sent your secretary to select. Mind you, a rose won't cut the mustard today, certainly not tonight. He debated these weighty matters. He saw that Dana was engaged in trying on a brown fur jacket thing near the changing rooms, and Cressida was smiling and nodding at her mother and holding up the lace curtain thing beside it. Cressida turned her mother around to face the mirror. They both nodded their heads. Then Dana took off the fur thing and looked at the price ticket and scowled. She showed Cressida, and both women shook their heads. The fur thing was put back on the hanger, and they made their way towards Hugo. Aha! Right, spot on, Hugo thought. Problem solved. Dana wants a fur jacket, and that is exactly what she will get for her birthday. She won't be expecting it, since she obviously thought the price was out of her league. Oh yes, he had seen her reaction to that. Birthday gift idea problem solved, and a happy Dana in one fell swoop, with the added bonus that Cressida would not have to trawl the streets with him looking for the present now that he had found what to buy her. Cressida would now be free to continue shopping. There were plans to visit makeup and cosmetic shops, he had heard with growing horror and alarm, with her mother. Excellent. Hugo could grab the fur thing, pay for it, and then off to the pub, leaving the women free to do whatever they liked until lunchtime. In Hugo's relief at having sorted out this irksome chore, he'd forgotten his real purpose of being until he was summoned towards the cash desk as the mountain of clothes was packaged, wrapped and bagged, and a delightful Monica told him in sweet Latin tones that would be £182.67, please. Fuck Clint Eastwood, Hugo thought. I'm obviously not a good man since I didn't know my limitations. £182.67 is way beyond them. Or was it, though? Hugo remembered his platinum card, the one he kept in reserve. He'd just paid the bill, so he could use the credit that accrued to the balance as a result of his payment before it was depleted by the addition of next month's interest. Monica's smile was actually a little too sickly sweet, Hugo decided as he handed over the plastic. Once the shopping mission had been duly dispatched and the women, and more importantly Hugo, were safely out of the shop, Hugo announced that he had things to do. Well, we've still got to get the cosmetics and bits and bobs, Dana advised. And I need knickers from Primark, Cressida added. Hugo held up both hands. No, absolutely not. He shook his head as well. There's no way on God's green earth that I'm going into Primark. No way. Not on a Saturday at midday. In fact, not any day. Hugo remembered the last expedition to Primark to kit out Cressida for a school skiing trip. It still brought tears to his eyes. God almighty, it was like a pilgrimage to Mecca, one where they all stampede and people die. And, if I might add, Hugo continued, it is hardly appropriate that I come with you to purchase intimate apparel. Well thought of, that one, he congratulated himself. That should floor them. Cressida nodded her head vigorously in agreement as the notion just dawned on her. I suppose so then, Dana reluctantly agreed. We can do that bit ourselves. Hugo perked up, let off the hook, and in his anxiety to keep the momentum going, he added, Of course, I will pay for whatever essentials Cressida requires. The women agreed, decision made, almost. But Dad, don't you and me have to go and, get something? Cressida inclined her head towards her father. Ah, yes, but no, actually. This is very firmly in hand, sweetheart. Hugo smiled. Cressida moved around to her father and whispered in his ear, Are you sure, Dad? What are you going to buy her? Don't you need my help? Hugo gave her a hug. Not at all. I've seen something that will be just perfect, and I assure you, Cressida, that you in particular will be very pleased with my choice of gift. Not only will your mother love it, but you will approve it wholeheartedly yourself. With that, Hugo guided them to the doors of the shopping centre and waved them off down Western Road towards the delights of Primark on a wet Saturday morning. Hugo now strode back towards Zara with determination and purpose. He was very pleased indeed with himself on two fronts. He'd extricated himself from the agony of having to do any more shopping with the women, other than this one little task, and he'd saved hours of trouble later in searching for a present for Dana. And as a bonus, he would be sitting with a pint in hand. He felt that he could now manage a whole one instead of a half, and the telegraph crossword in less than 15 minutes. Back inside the store, Hugo made straight for the changing room and the rail of fur things. A gaggle of girls stood in his way. He waited politely for them to shift. Then a stout woman barged in front with a tent-like garment on a hanger on her way to the changing room. He waited a little less politely for her to pass. Then a male assistant, where had he sprung from? Hugo hadn't noticed any men before, pushed a consignment of new stock across his path, blocking his way to the rail of furs. Can it never be easy? Hugo asked himself. Still, he could see the fur jacket sitting on the rail, just out of reach. That made matters even easier. Just the one jacket. The others were scarves and collars, so no problem about having to negotiate sizes and things. The male assistant parked the new clothes rail, impeding Hugo's progress, while he chatted with the girl outside the changing room. The latter laughed and joked and continued to process the women coming and going with clothes through the changing rooms, handing out little plastic numbers and taking back unwanted clothes as they passed through on their way out. Come on, Hugo said under his breath. The assistants continued to chat, oblivious. Excuse me, Hugo asked. They ignored him. Hugo cleared his throat. I say, excuse me, please, he said a little louder this time, over the rail of clothes in front of him. Both assistants now looked up at him, irritated by the interruption to their conversation. I'm just trying to get to that jacket, just there. Hugo pointed to the brown fur jacket on the rail to the right of the assistant, as he leaned over the clothes rail that blocked his path. Which one? The female assistant asked him. That furry jacket, just there beside you. Hugo stabbed his finger and then his whole hand towards it. Just then, a woman with several other coats under her arm swept it off the rail, held it up to the light, looked at the price ticket, smiled, added it to the pile under her arm, and marched off to the cash desk with it. The shop assistants both looked at Hugo. He stood panic-stricken. The afternoon's quiet enjoyment, the pint, the crossword, everything hung in the balance, not to mention Dana's happiness, or at least her birthday present. It's gone, the male assistant informed him. Well, I can see that. If I'd been able to get to the ruddy thing without all this, Hugo waved his arms at the clothes rail, obstruction, and I could have bought it. Hugo glared at them both. Do you have any more? He asked. The male assistant smirked at the female assistant and went off with his consignment of clothes, clearing a path to the rail that Hugo had sought, now minus the jacket. No, last one. Monica smiled. Bloody marvellous, Hugo thought, as he stomped towards the door. The Latin exoticism had lost its charm. He'd always preferred an English rose anyway, just like his father. As the seconds turned to minutes and the minutes threatened to turn to hours, Hugo realised that he was practically jogging down towards the lanes in a blind panic. Mission present remained unaccomplished. As his mind raced wildly and he struggled to marshal his thoughts, he was unable even to remember any comforting or inspiring Eastwood quotes. He swung down the steps past the gaudy pub, now bursting at the seams with midday drinkers, don't know they're born, he thought, sprinted down Cranbourne Street, now pedestrianised, but might as well be a Formula One racetrack, the amount of baby buggies he had to dodge, straight over the traffic lights without even waiting to see if they were green, flew down Duke Street, swivelling his head right at the Pandora jewellery shop as he did so, and continued down towards Ship Street, seething as he passed Colin Page bookshop and craning his neck left to see what he was missing. Truth was, all thoughts of pints, the Telegraph and books were long gone. He only had one purpose in life now, to find Dana a present. Fuck, but what? As he stood at the intersection of Duke Street and Ship Street, he looked back at Pandora. Jewellery? He was useless at that sort of thing. And anyway, he wasn't in Tristram's league. Pandora wasn't Asprey, but he was pretty sure it wasn't cheap either. There was always lingerie, he supposed. Something black or red. What about that Ann Summers shop? Dana always liked pretty lingerie. Women did, didn't they? Once, when they'd been in Selfridges, or was it Harvey Nichols, years ago. Well, anyway, Hugo had noticed a lingerie shop where the assistants had all dressed up in the gear. Bit racy, he'd thought. Provocative something or other. No, that wasn't it. Agent provocative. No, it was French, like the phrase. Agent provocateur. Yes, that was it. Dana had liked that, years ago. Or at least she had looked at it. Was Ann Summers the same thing? He had no idea. But he had spotted an Ann Summers shop up on Western Road. Yes, Hugo decided, that was it. He'd go back up there and buy some red lingerie, just like Agent provocateur, and be done with the present business. Christ, he wished Cress was there with him. Just as he turned to go back, someone came out of the bagel shop and bumped into him. Sorry, mate, a man said to him in a smear of bagel and cream cheese. No, my fault entirely, wasn't concentrating. Which is the easiest way back up to Western Road? Hugo asked the man. Straight along here, Ship Street, and then the road at the end is North Street both ways. Turn left and North Street becomes Western Road." The man wandered off, chewing his bagel. Hugo realised he was now hungry and thirsty. That spurred him on. "Right, let's get this present over and done with," he thought as he marched down Ship Street. He had progressed only a few hundred yards when he caught up short and stopped in his tracks. To his right, a tiny shop nestled between TK Maxx discount store and a sweet shop caught his eye. It was painted black with a sign in purple swirling lettering that proclaimed Penelope's Portmanteau Vintage. And sitting smack in the middle of the window on a mannequin was a brown fur jacket. Bingo! Hugo hesitated for only a second. As he put his hand on the door, it looked a little pricey, but to hell with it. The pint was practically shouting his name by now, and went in. Excellent! A lovely little shop. Hugo was astonished to hear those words uttered from his own mouth in reaction to a retail establishment, hitherto anathema to him. A very attractive blonde lady looked up from behind a small purple desk and smiled. "Thank you," she said. My word, what an attractive lady, Hugo thought, not sure if his excitement at being so close to his girl was getting the better of him. "Can I help you with anything in particular?" the lady asked him. Hugo advanced towards the desk, looking around at all manner of glittering jewellery, exotic handbags, and quite a few fur coats. He nodded at his own discerning taste, and for his zeitgeist. Fur is obviously à la mode, de rigueur, very now, the new look, and so on, as he ran out of adjectives. In short, it was obviously very much in fashion, judging by this shop. Well, Zara's loss was, what was this place called? Portmanteau. Penelope's Portmanteau Vintage, whatever the latter meant, gain. "You most certainly can," Hugo gushed in excitement. The attractive lady stood up. "Are you looking for a present?" she asked him. Goodness, serendipity, Hugo thought. On exactly the same wavelength, this bodes well. It didn't occur to him that men in shops like this were either transvestites, it was Brighton after all, or looking for a present. Hugo did not look like a transvestite, the incident with Bella in the hallway notwithstanding. "I most definitely am," he beamed. Hugo strode towards the mannequin in the window and pointed. "And there it is," he said with a flourish. The assistant smiled and went over to the window. "What size are you looking for?" she asked him, as she began to unbutton the fur jacket on the mannequin. Well, I'm not exactly sure, to be honest. Small, I think." Hugo still spoke with purpose, but he was on slightly uneven terrain now. The assistant, however, obviously a master of managing nervous male shoppers, was very helpful. "Would you say a 10 or a 12? She asked him, as she moved the fur from the dummy. "Ah, well now, you see, I'm not so sure." Hugo racked his brains. What size was Dana? Bigger than Cressida and much smaller than her mother Bella. But that was a useless analogy, since he knew no more about the other two sizes than Dana's. Hugo had a brainwave. "I reckon that the lady in question is about your size," he told the assistant. She smiled. "Would you like me to try it on so you can gauge it better? That would be excellent, if you don't mind." The assistant nodded her head and took off her own jacket. Very shapely, Hugo observed, and about Dana's size too. Things were looking good all around. The assistant put the fur jacket on and stood in front of Hugo. She turned this way and that, put the collar up, the cuffs down, buttoned it and unbuttoned it. "How's that?" she finally asked him. "Perfect, just perfect," Hugo beamed. "Would you like to take it?" the assistant asked. She took the fur jacket off and handed it to Hugo to examine. Yes, I think so. How much is it?" Again he waited with inhaled breath. £125, she smiled. Now, ordinarily, Hugo would have exclaimed, "Christ!" However, he had observed Dana's reaction to the price of the other fur jacket in Zara, and how she had balked at that. Therefore, this one must be a fraction of the cost, and therefore an absolute bargain. Dana would be pleased. "Definitely, I'll take it. Thank you so much." Hugo handed the fur jacket back to the lovely assistant, who whipped it away to the desk and started to wrap it up in elaborate tissue paper suit carrier and fancy pink paper carrier bag. "How would you like to pay?" she asked him. "Platinum MasterCard." Hugo handed over his credit card with a flourish. But who is he kidding, he admitted as the payment went through. As the assistant wrapped and processed the transaction, she told him about the fur jacket. "Specialist clean, obviously, but as it is natural fur, it can get wet, but just make sure the lady lets it dry naturally," she explained. Yes, got that." Mission accomplished, he was now anxious to get to the pub before meeting up with the others. The lady continued, "And the recipient might be interested to know that the fur is from a big cat and is dyed to look like mink." She handed Hugo the bag. "Cat, big, dyed, yes, got that too." Hugo took the bag as he looked at his watch. 12:30. "You have been a great help, Miss..." he asked her. Fiona. I'm the owner, she smiled in reply. Well, thanks again, Fiona. I think I will be in the good books for this. Hugo laughed and nodded as he walked towards the door.